481 BC, 3414 AM. Xerxes, son of Darius, assembled the largest army the world had ever seen until that time, which passed over the Dardanelles by way of a bridge of boats after King Xerxes visited the ancient Troy, the city famous for the Trojan War. His magi sacrificed 1,000 cattle to the spirits of the ancient Trojan heroes. Then the Persian army marched on into Greece. The Greek states formed the Hellenic League at a congress convened at the old city of Corinth, delegating the defence of the realm to the leadership of the warlike Spartans. In response to the consultation of the Delphic oracle, Themistocles paid for a fleet of warships from the money acquired by a rich load of silver discovered at Laurion. Under Xerxes, the Persian army marched into Greece with many auxiliaries from the nations of the empire, many of them descendants of Judah and Israel, as an eclipse darkened the sun. Herodotus in the Histories wrote that the Persians saw this omen favourably because the moon covered the sun a Grecian symbol, while the moon was venerated in the east. Strangely, right before the battle at Salamis, a giant of a man named Artachaeus, who stood 8 foot 2 inches tall, died of a sickness, a man of the famous Persian Achaemenid family. At Thermopylae, a force of 1,400 Spartans under Leonidas held a tiny pass the Persian army sent to enter, and these 1,400 men lost their lives in a flurry of unsurpassed violence that inflicted enormous casualties upon the Persian army, severely wounding their morale as the Spartans held the pass. It was learned that tens of thousands of able-bodied Greeks were off at Olympia, assembled during the end of the Olympic Games to observe a famous wrestling final, and were not overly concerned about the Persian presence. One of Xerxes' generals asked in shock, quote, "What sort of men have you brought us to fight?" unquote. The battle for Thermopylae gave rise to the legend of the 300. According to Josephus in his Antiquities, the Spartans, once called the Lacedaemonians, were kin to the Jews and were of the stock of Abraham. In fact, the seal of Sparta was the same as the seal of the Israelite tribe of Dan, an eagle with a serpent in its claws. This would later appear on the military standards of the United States of America. Humbled by the Spartan resistance, the Persians made it through Thermopylae and advanced on Thebes, which surrendered. Themistocles informed the Athenian government that the Delphic oracle predicted the fall of Athens, but also declared that victory would fall to the Greeks if they relied on, quote, "the wooden walls," unquote. As the walls of Athens were stone, this was interpreted to mean that they would gain the upper hand by their navy. As the Persians neared Athens, it was burned down and evacuated. The Athenian army then met the superior navy of the Persians at Salamis, and Xerxes watched in disbelief as his ships were systematically destroyed. This occurred during the archonship of Calliades. On land, the Persians did not fare well either. Without a navy with which to ship over food and supplies, Xerxes retreated back into Asia with half of his surviving army, leaving the other half camped at Plataea. After the battle, some Greeks rummaged through the battlefield and found a Persian body that stood 7.5 foot tall. The Magonid general Hamilcar of Carthage led an invasion force of 300,000 men and landed in Sicily to attack the Greek cities of Syracuse and Acragas, 2 cities founded long ago by Ionian and Danaan Greeks. The Carthaginian army had contingents from North Africa, Spain, Gaul, Liguria, and Sardinia. Amazingly, this massive invasion was repelled by these Greek cities, and the Greeks imposed a 20,000 silver talent fine for war reparations. Carthage would go on to leave the Greeks alone for 70 years. According to Greek historians Ephorus and Diodorus, this invasion was masterminded by the Persians. Carthage was on its way to housing 1 million people. From Carthage, with its dominant Phoenician Semitic population, much of it of Hebrew stock, sent out expeditions into the Atlantic that made it to the British Isles and Central America, where innumerous Phoenician relics and evidences have been discovered in modern times. Carthage maintained colonies throughout the Mediterranean, along the African coast and the coasts of the Atlantic along Africa and Europe. It is interesting that among all the nationalities that were led by the Carthaginians against the Greeks, not a Celt was among them. The Celts and Greeks were on the friendliest terms. Not even Xerxes had any Celts in his auxiliaries. As will be shown throughout the remainder of this chronology, the Celts were of direct Israelite descent. Their affinity toward the Greeks was more than neighbourly, a blood kinship. It was about this time that Protagoras was teaching that men were the measure of all things. This battle and series of battles and Greek victory was 930 years, 792 plus 138, after 1411 BC, when the Israelites began their conquest against the giant kingdoms of Og of Bashan and Sion of Argob. As the early Greeks were Ionian and Danaan Israelites, we are not surprised to find that this was 888 years after the Israelites sailed into the Aegean and landed on the ancient coast that would become the Greek world in 1369 BC. This was 480 years after the temple was finished in Jerusalem in 961 BC, and 240 years after the remaining Israelites were carried off into captivity by the Assyrians in 721 BC, after the fall of Samaria. This was 66 years, 792 months, after the burning of the Delphic Oracle Temple and its rebuilding in 547 BC, and 48 years, 576 months, after 529 BC, when Cyrus of Persia was killed and the Persians were defeated by the Massagetae Scythians, a people descended from Israel. Finally, the Greek victories are exactly 148 years, 776 months, to the fall of Persia by the Greek Macedonian army in 333 BC, led by Alexander of Macedon. 1. The Poisoned King. 2. Pliny, Natural History footnote. 3. Herodotus, The Histories Book. 4. The Naked Olympics. 5. Post-Captivity Names of Israel. 6. Secrets of Time. 7. The Histories, Herodotus, Book 1x. 8. Phoenicians. 9. A Short History of the World. 10. Celtic Myths and Legends.